think you realize down here in Birmingham what you mean to us up there in New York. And I don't think that white Americans understand what Birmingham means to all of us throughout this country. And we think about the little kids being tossed from one side of the street to the other by the tremendous force of this hose. And we think about, this picture just sickens me, this big brave policeman down here with his knee on the throat of this lady. And the problem of it is, ladies and gentlemen, is that this same picture of the dogs and of this policeman with his knee in the throat of this lady, it's a picture that's being portrayed throughout the world. And I think the conscience of America is beginning to awaken. I think the first steps that were made here by the Birmingham businessmen with Dr. King and the other leaders down here is an indication that perhaps the conscience of Birmingham is beginning to awaken. The only thing that we are demanding is that we be allowed to move ahead just like any other American citizen.
This is not a baseball story about Jackie Robinson. That story has been told many, many, many times, many, many places. There have been books, there have been biopics, there have been movies, there have been countless newspaper articles. There has been a legion of conversation about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball. But there's another Jackie Robinson we're telling the story of. So Jackie Robinson, the civil rights fighter, the civil rights activist, the civil rights champion, that's the Jackie Robinson, and that's the story we're going to tell today. We're not at a baseball stadium where Jackie Robinson, the glory of Jackie Robinson is well known, breaking the color barrier. We're walking on 35th Street in South Los Angeles. And if you can see in the back, we're walking past several of the houses where Jackie actually lived in the late 40s. He lived in this neighborhood. He lived on this block. This is at a time when baseball was just opening up because of Jackie Robinson to African Americans. This is a 75th anniversary, April 18th, of Jackie Robinson's breaking the color barrier in baseball. That was a magic day. That was a memorable day. That was an earth-shattering and defining day. April 18th, 1946, 75 years ago. So we wanted to revisit the Jackie Robinson of the civil rights fame, the civil rights activist. And what better to do that than come into the neighborhood where Jackie Robinson actually lived for a period of time. He, during the first years of his marriage to Rachel Isom, and then, of course, later, Rachel Robinson, his wife, of many, many, many years. Jackie Robinson, the civil rights activist. One of the things in his great book, I Never Had It Made, Robinson laid it out that he never had it made. His great quote, "I was a black man in a white world. I never had it made."
But the team members, was this while you were on, when you came onto the field that they would yell things, or was it while the game was going on? I mean, could some of it have been just strategy to help?
Well, they thought, I was sure that a lot of it was thought to be strategy, but it wasn't going to upset me. There was really too much to be done at that particular time in terms of breaking the baseball barrier to allow name calling to bother me. I keep remembering what my mother told me when I was a kid, although I've always been a guy that turned back. She said something about sticks and stones will break your bones, you know, and so not to be concerned about it. Well, I didn't at the time, and fortunate for the advice that I got from Mr. Rickey and the encouragement and the guidance I got from my wife at home, we were able to withstand most of the kinds of situations that came up. We were prepared because of the numbers of people on our side.
Yeah. This is a story about Robinson, who famously said, "I cannot stand and sing the national anthem. I cannot salute the flag. I know that I'm a black man in a white world. I never had it made." That was Robinson's mantra over and over again. Let's talk about Robinson as a civil rights activist, champion, and fighter. You know, Jackie, on the 75th anniversary, I think is so important. You know, Robinson talked a lot, both during baseball and after baseball, about one incident that defined his life early on. And that was when Jackie Robinson was in the service, World War II. He was stationed in Texas and, of course, later Louisiana. Jackie Robinson was court-martialed. Many people don't know that. The court-martial of Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. What did Jackie Robinson do? Jackie Robinson refused to move to the back of a segregated bus. He stood on principle. This is a young Jackie Robinson. Said, I'm not going to be discriminated against. I'm not going to be a part of that. He was court-martialed, and it was a famous trial. And Jackie Robinson came very, very close to being convicted, and of course, his career, who knows what would have happened. But Jackie persevered. It was a call to celebrate. The NAACP got involved, and it was a wake-up call, a major wake-up call for Jackie about race and racism in America. So the court-martial of a young Jackie Robinson was one of the first introductions Robinson had to fighting back against racism and racial discrimination in America. Branch Rickey Baseball told Jackie, you're going to be the first. In the Dodger organization, you're going to have the wrath of the baseball world on you because you're breaking that barrier. But Jackie Robinson even then stepped out of the role of a baseball player and a trendsetter to be a civil rights activist. In 1949, Paul Robeson, the famed singer and actor, made the statement in the Soviet Union. Paul Robeson was a communist, certainly leaning left-wing activist. And he made the statement that African Americans will not fight against the Soviet Union. The wrath of the nation came down on Robeson. Robinson then was in his second, third year in the majors. He was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he agreed to testify. The game plan was that Jackie would savage Paul Robeson, and he didn't. He made this great statement. He said, we're not going to stop fighting race discrimination in this country until we've got it lit. Robinson later said he regretted going before the HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he would not do it again. Certainly he would not denigrate Paul Robeson, who he had great respect for. But nonetheless, I stand by my statement about racism and race discrimination, racial discrimination in America. We're going to keep fighting that, and I'm going to keep fighting that.
Whether you like it or not, and whether you think that we ought to participate, that there is not one Negro, not one that I know in this country, that hasn't made until the most underprivileged Negro in St. Augustine, Florida has it made.
This is not a baseball story. It's not a sports story. It's a story about a man who was chosen to be the first in sport, baseball in this case. But he also understood something else, as he said over and over again in his book, I Never Had It Made. I was a black man in a white world. I never had it made. When we think of Jackie Robinson, 75 years after breaking the color barrier in baseball, that's the Robinson that I and we must remember. That's the Robinson we must never forget.
The only thing that we're demanding is that we be allowed to move ahead just like any other American citizen.